Welcome, everybody. We are very delighted to be with you today. Oh, sorry for the echo. Okay. We are delighted to be with you today for a new webinar on the ISAC Global Chinese Catholicism Project. I'm Eva Salerno from the Catholic University of Paris. Before introducing today's speaker and respondents, let me remind you that the aim of our project is to highlight any research on contemporary Chinese Catholic communities wherever they may be in the world. Oh, sorry for this echo. Thank you. We also want to give authors the opportunity to present their work, and that is the case today, as we are pleased to welcome Professor Jin Lu, who is here to present her book, Translingual Catholics, Chinese Theologians Before Vatican II, which has just been published by University of Notre Dame Press. Jin Lu is a professor of French at Purdue University Northwest. Her main areas of research are located at the intersection of language, literature, and culture with historical and global perspectives. Her publications have focused on cultural journals in 18th century France, Jesuits in France and China, cross-cultural practice, and translingual Chinese Catholic intellectuals situated in the intersecting global Catholic networks of their time. Many thanks, Professor Lu, for being here with us today. And we are privileged to have two respondents who will share their comments and suggestions with Professor Lu and us. Let me introduce Dr. Alexander Chow and Professor Benoit Vermondaire. Dr. Alexander Chow is the senior lecturer in theology and world Christianity at the School of Divinity, University of Edinburgh, and co-director of the Center for the Study of World Christianity. He has published on Chinese Christian theology, world Christianity, and migration, and he's editor of the Liu Institute series in Chinese Christianities. Professor Benoit Vermondaire is a professor in the Department of Religious Sciences at Fudan University, where he teaches comparative spirituality, Asian theology, and religious anthropology. He has also published in the field of hermeneutics of Chinese classics. Thank you both very much for agreeing to participate in our webinar. For our audience, if you have any questions during the presentation, please feel free to write them in the chat. I will now hand over to Professor Jin Lu for her presentation. Thank you.
Can you all hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, depending on where you are. Thank you all for coming. Thank you, Michelle, for your organization and technical support, Eva for inviting me and hosting this webinar, Alex and Benoit for serving as discussant. I truly appreciate this opportunity. There can be so many ways to present a book that's over 300 pages long and took me about 8 years to research and write. Remembering the time that it took me to write this book also is an opportunity to acknowledge how much this book owes to the University of Notre Dame, the incredible team of Notre Dame Press, the Liu Institute for Asia and Asian Studies, and then Notre Dame Institute for Advanced Study, which offered me a 1-year fellowship to work on the book. This photo was taken from the window of what used to be my office for a year. An incredible view, very motivating. Let me first explain my title. The book studies the life experiences and the theological writings of a group of Republican-era translingual Chinese Catholic intellectuals. The word
Dine, I'm
translingual...
sorry to intervene.
Yes.
You're not sharing your screen.
I'm so sorry. I thought I did. Okay, let me see how I would do that. Thank you very much for reminding me, because I can see that. Can we see it now?
Yes, we can.
Okay, thank you. Okay. I'm really sorry. I think I need to go back to show you the view that I talked about, or else it wouldn't make any sense. Yeah. Yeah. I'm losing my pages. Okay, now I'm where I am. So can everybody see my PPT and my...
Yes, we can.
So let me first explain my title. This book studies the life experience. Okay, hold on. It's sending me messages. Okay. This book studying the life experience and the theological writings of a group of Republican-era translingual Chinese Catholic intellectuals. The word translingual refers broadly to authors who write in more than one language, or at least in a language other than their primary one. Due to the French protectorate over Catholic mission in China after the Second Opium War, a significant number of Chinese Catholic figures had ties to the Francophone world and thus wrote important works in French. Being translingual allowed the Republican-era Chinese Catholic theologians to be inscribed in various intersecting global Catholic networks. My book focuses on the Jesuit enclave of Xujiahui in Shanghai, the Benedictine Abbey of Saint-André in Bruges, Belgium, the Jesuit Theologate in LyonFourvière, and the ecumenical Cercle Saint-Jean-Baptiste in Paris. Those global networks included Chinese Catholic intellectuals as well as worldwide Catholic figures who took the theological position that Christianity should be rooted in different cultures in the world in order to realize its true universality. It is through those intersecting global networks that the Republican-era Chinese Catholics participated in the elaboration of Catholic theology in the decades before Vatican II, which was held from 1962 to 1965, exactly 60 years ago. Vatican II was held at a time when Catholics in mainland China did not have any ways of knowing about it. Only by viewing Chinese Catholicism in its global context that it is then possible to honor the theological contribution made by Chinese Catholics in the decades before Vatican II. Through archival research and textual analysis, this book discovered that while Chinese Catholics did not appear to have played a prominent role at the Vatican II sessions, some of their multilingual members were part of the global movement that paved the way to the Council. The term inculturation became widely known in the mid-1970s in missiological studies and the 1977 Synod documents to refer to the process through which the local culture gives new expressions to the theology transmitted by missionaries and enriches the universal church. It is therefore not a one-way accommodation for specific cultures from an immutable theological center, but recognize the fact that local cultures in turn enriches Christian theology. Inculturation engages specific cultures without becoming trapped in essentialism. Inscribed in history, cultures can be observed and described at any given historical time as they continue to evolve, while the gospel which is incarnated in them responds to their changing needs while transforming them. This process cannot happen without translingual contributors, such as Matteo Ricci writing in Chinese and the Translingual Catholics in my book writing in multiple languages. My book studies the texts they produced and treats them seriously as contributions to the development of Chinese as well as global Catholic theology. The next point I would like to explain is the cover image. While it is true that we cannot judge a book by its cover, in this case, this cover is emblematic of my main arguments in the book in its multiple layers. 1. The interconnectedness of various global Catholic networks. 2. Chinese Catholic theologians' contribution to Catholic theology before Vatican II, especially in regard to the relationship between Catholicism and Chinese spiritual traditions. And 3. The translingual context in which the Chinese theologians produced and circulated their texts. The cover image is crafted from Ma Xiangbo's calligraphy on a scroll featuring an excerpt from Zhuangzi chapter 33, 天下篇, Under Heaven, 与造物有, Walk with the Creator. It was a gift from Chinese Catholics to Lu Zhenxiang, sent in celebration of his ordination on June 29, 1935. Lu Zhenxiang's ordination was a much anticipated and elaborate global Catholic event. The 94-year-old Ma Xiangbo called on all those who had friendly relations with Lu Zhenxiang to express their congratulations and send their gifts to Ma's residence in Shanghai to Shanwan, so that all gifts representing Chinese culture and fine arts could be packaged together to be sent to Belgium. On the day of the ordination, the abbatial church was decorated with embroideries and gift from Catholic figures from all over the world by China's highest government officials, as well as a wide range of Catholic figures. Catholics and non-Catholics, while congratulating Lu for his ordination, expressed their understanding of his Catholic faith and virtue. Based on the Abbey's record, Chinese Catholics sent an 8-meter-long scroll of calligraphy with inscriptions by Ma Xiangbo and 4 big characters distinctly inspired by Zhuangzi. This inscription situated Zhuangzi's thought in a Catholic interpretation. Wang Changzhi, then a student at the Jesuit Theologate of LyonFourvière, was among the attendees of Lu Zhenxiang's ordination in 1935, and could not have failed to notice such an impressive scroll with mass calligraphy, a gift offered in the name of Chinese Catholics. In December of the following year, 1936, Wang Changzhi left France to return to China. In his March 11, 1937 letter to Father Gaston Fessard, Wang talked about the early draft of an article on Zhuangzi's mysticism that the director of the series Variétés Sinologiques wanted to publish, but Father Wang was too busy to complete it. Wang Changzhi's article on Zhuangzi's mysticism was eventually published in 1941 in the Bulletin of Aurora University, a Jesuit university in Shanghai. Like Ma Xiangbo's calligraphy, Wang's article also focused on chapter 33 of Zhuangzi. Based on this timeline, I believe that Wang Changzhi's writings on Zhuangzi was inspired by Ma's calligraphy. The Centre d'Archives et d'Études Cardinal Henri de Lubac, it was then in Namur, Belgium, conserved an off-print of the article signed and sent to de Lubac by Wang, dated October 29, 1941, almost immediately upon the release of the volume, and that was in the middle of the war. Wang Changzhi's text was thus inscribed in a global Catholic network connected by the circulation of journal publication and correspondence among theologians. It was the earliest text which interprets Zhuangzi from the perspective of Christian mysticism, especially Jesuit spirituality, in which Wang was deeply immersed. Using Ma Xiangbo's calligraphy on the book cover also serves to highlight Ma Xiangbo's place as the father of modern Chinese Catholicism. My book shows that many initiatives can be traced back to him. They're too numerous for me to mention one by one, but I will touch upon some of those. My book is not a collection of essays on various individual Chinese Catholic theologians, but rather endeavors to study them in their interconnectedness based on archival resources and printed materials. First, their relationships are generational. They all declare themselves successor of the late Ming Chinese Catholics, such as Xu Guangqi. Some of them were like brothers, such as Ma Xiangbo and Yin Lianzhi, Lu Zhenxiang and Xu Zongze. Relationships of affiliation and influence exist between Ma Xiangbo and Lu Zhenxiang, as between Lu Zhenxiang and Wu Jinxiong. As Wang Changzhi's student, Jin Luxian faithfully preserved his teacher's memory and tirelessly promoted his merits. They were protagonists as well as writers of the history of Chinese Catholicism. As you can see from the graph, they are also globally connected, and increasingly so. This book is based on research that I conducted over the course of several years in 7 different archives, including Jesuit Archive in Vanves, Basilica Notre Dame of Fourvière, Lyon, Lu Zhenxiang Archives in Abbey Saint-André in Bruges, Jesuit Archive in Taipei, Archives de l'Oratoire, Paris, Centre d'Archives d'Études Cardinal Henri de Lubac in Namur, and Pontifical Gregorian University in Rome. Tracing the steps of the Republican-era Chinese Catholic intellectuals necessitated a visit to some archives that had become, for various historical reasons, short-staffed and therefore with uncertain access. All the archives had their own idiosyncrasies, and I gained access to them through different ways based on specific situations that existed at the time. My encounters with each one of them constitute a part of the backstory for this book, too long to be told here. Let me just share a guest post that I wrote for the website of University of Notre Dame Press, The Wonder of the Archive. I see if I can post it in chat, if I can find it. Yes, I can. So it's right there. I'm going to share that. Perfect. Get back to my presentation. Although we do not have the time for a deep dive into the book, I would like to give you an overview of its content today, as much as I can. Let me see how much time I have. Okay, yeah. Well, if I cannot finish in the overview, I can stop anytime. My goal is to share as much as I can within the limits of 30 minutes. So, Michelle, make sure that you stop me if I go over my time.
You have 10 minutes left.
Okay. Chapter 1 opens with the historical moment when Ma Xiangbo and Yin Lianzhi wrote a joint petition to Pope Pius X in 1912. This letter is included in various editions of Ma's works in Chinese. So part of the public assume that this is just from Ma Xiangbo. On the other hand, works that rely on sources in Western languages tend to attribute it only to Yin Lianzhi, as he was the one who signed the document sent to the Pope. I attribute this letter to both, based on multiple sources that I have. The chapter starts with an analysis of this petition as an essay on evangelization method. Following the multiple threads in this catalyst letter, I then examine the historical moment that Ma and Yin seized to directly appeal to the Pope in 1912, before revisiting the history of Christianity in China as a battleground for competing theologies and locating the life of Ma, Yin, and other Chinese Catholics in this story. This paper uncovers archival evidence that conclusively proves Ma Xiangbo's priestly status after his return to the Jesuit enclave in Xujiahui in 1897, and Lu Zhenxiang's role in ascertaining this recognition with the Vatican. See here the letter from Cardinal Secretary of State Luigi Maglione. I know that it's hard to read I'm just trying to show my evidence, but I understand that the word might be too small to be seen. And also the letter from Cardinal Secretary of State Montigny, future Pope Paul VI to Lu Zhenxiang. Chapter 2 reconstructs the making of a Catholic network in China around what I call the 3 pillars of Chinese Catholicism in the early years of the Republican era, from 1912 to 1927. Ma Xiangbo, Yin Lianzhi, and Lu Zhenxiang, who were galvanized by the shared goals of a broad engagement with Chinese society. It tells a story of how Chinese Catholics strove to ground Chinese Catholicism in its own history and connect it to global Catholicism with the support of missionaries such as Vincent Lab and Antoine Godin. Grounded in comparative studying of documents in Chinese and Western language, the largest of them in French, this chapter analyzes the alliance as well as differences between Ma and Yin versus Lab and Kota. Ma and Yin were the ones who spearheaded the movement to promote the heritage of the late Ming Jesuits and Chinese Christians who laid the foundation for Chinese Christianity. For them, it's very important that Christianity in China had a history that they were writing. They genuinely admire Lab and Kota's love of China and view them as the successor of the best missionary China had ever had, which were Jesuits like Ricci. With Lab and Kota, they share the same goal of connecting Chinese Catholicism directly to Rome and freeing Chinese Catholicism from the control of European states. However, there are also significant areas of disagreement, especially in regard to the assessment of the first Jesuit mission. Ma and Yin believe that Ricci and his successor used the best method of evangelization, which consists of using learning, 学问, for the apostolate. Wherever Ma and Yin sought to revive Ricci's method, Lab expounded a more guarded assessment in his draft report prepared for Monseigneur Gaston Van Feuille, who is Lacroix correspondent in Rome at the time. In the historical overview part of the report, Lab reduced Ricci's method to the conversion of the imperial court, starting from the emperors, or for lack of it, their protection. I think this view is quite common. Became the first Jesuit mission, despite some real successes, was a failure in the end, concluded Lab. There was no question in Kota's mind that the Chinese rites were indeed idolatrous, and he blamed the Jesuits for resisting the Pope for 100 years. Lab and Kota's position seemed straightforward and easy to explain. 1. All missionaries should obey the popes. 2. Native clergy should be cultivated and promoted to leadership positions, including the episcopate. They could not have predicted that the Holy See's policy on Chinese rights would shift in 1939. This chapter contends that the seeds of Benedict's 15th apostolic letter, Maximum Illud, were contained in Ma and Yin's 1912 letter to Pope Pius X. It traces the process by which, through a convergence of factors, Chinese Catholicism became connected with global Catholicism, enabling some of its brightest multilingual members to eventually have their voices heard in the decades before the Second Vatican Council. One of Ma Xiangbo's wishes was to have Lu Zhenxiang serve as China's envoy to the Vatican, a wish that can be said to have been realized in an extraordinary way. Chapter 3 centers on the Abbey of Saint-André as a center for global Chinese Catholic networks. This chapter examines Lu Zhenxiang's role as a link between the Vatican and China before the establishment of official diplomatic relations in 1942 and the context in which his intellectual apostolate was inscribed between 1942 and 1949, the year he died. It starts with a careful examination of the nature of the collaboration between Dom Edward Neutre and Lu Zhenxiang, which formed the foundation of what Lu Zhenxiang accomplished during his time in the Abbey of Saint-André. Lu and Neutre maintained a massive web of connections with Catholics and non-Catholic Chinese residing in various parts of the world, as well as with Vatican officials and notable Catholic figures worldwide. It then traces how the Confucian Lu Zhenxiang established his own Chinese Catholic genealogy by declaring himself a follower of Xu Guangqi, officially asking Ma Xiangbo to be his teacher, and connecting with numerous brothers and sisters. It follows the events that the Abbey orchestrated, or for which it was an important actor, especially in 1933 celebration of the tercentenary of the death of Xu Guangqi and the movement for his beatification. Abbot Theodore Neff's visit to China and Lu Zhenxiang's ordination in 1935. idea of celebrating the centenary of death of Xu Guangqi and petitioning for his beatification likely came from Ma Xiangbo, who was already brainstorming with Xu Zongze about commemorating the tercentenary of the death of the three pillars of the late Ming Chinese Catholicism in 1926.
You have 2 minutes left.
Oh, I won't, that's a lot of detail I won't be able to get into. I just want to show that I discovered that Wang Changzhi had a hidden role in proposing how to go about the celebration and the proposal for Xu Guangqi's beatification. So I will just move forward my slide. That's a photo of in the next chapter, chapter 4, about Wu Jinxiong and Lu Zhengxiang's conversion narrative. And I have lots of archival research that show their friendship that inspired both of them and influenced the texts that they produced. And this is letter that Henri de Lubac wrote to Lu Zhengxiang after he read his book Souvenirs et Pensées. And chapter 5 focuses more on Wang Changzhi, who I already mentioned. And I think he is one of the most underestimated Catholic figure that I study. And then chapter 6 focuses on François Huang Jiacheng, who was really well known in France, but not so much elsewhere. Then my final chapter is focused on Chinese Catholicism's mystic turn, and I connect that with the Ressourcement movement in France in the same period of time, which is the decades before Vatican II. And finally, I want to say that this book itself, it's also part of, by writing this book, I want to make sure that those Chinese translingual Catholic theologians become a source to which Chinese Christianity can return to, not to duplicate what they did, but to create, to develop it in the new global historical context. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Professor Lu, for your very interesting presentation. Sorry, we don't have more time to get deeper. You have many things to say, but let's go to the respondents.
Well, the book is over 300 pages long, so it's hard to know where to start. Thank you very much for your attention.
Of course, thank you, Jean. So I will now hand over to Dr. Chao for his comments.
Hello, can you hear me okay? Yeah, great. Thank you very much, Professor Jean Lu. Congratulations on the publication of this book. You cannot see, but you know what it is. This is a wonderful publication, and I'm speaking both as a scholar of Chinese Christianity, but also as the series editor for the book series that this book was published through, of Notre Dame University Press. And so I'm going to speak briefly on those two facets. One, the series, and also secondly, the book's contribution to the study of Chinese Christianities. Now, firstly, about the series, many years ago, when I began speaking to University of Notre Dame Press, we were talking about the possibility of creating a book series, and we realized that book series out there, there were maybe three major types of book series. One set of book series were very China-centric. That is, their focus of the books that were coming out were all looking at mainland China in particular, not really considering the networks and the movements of Chinese Christians beyond the mainland. Secondly, many of the series tended to be very historically oriented. So as a discipline, they tend to be very much rooted within the historical tradition and looking at archives, looking at missionary movements, as well as the developments of Chinese Christians. But thirdly, many series tended to be very confessionally oriented. That is, they either were all Protestants, studies on Protestantism or studies on Catholicism, or tended to focus on certain state-sanctioned expressions of Christianity or unregistered forms of Christianity. And so when we were talking about the series, we really wanted to produce a series that allows for a more complex conversation of what Chinese Christianities are. Because, as we know, humans are not just isolated to one context or one way of thinking or one tradition, but there's a mixture for each individual. We're mixtures of the environments that we're a part of. And actually, the story of Chinese Christianity is a global one, and it is multifaceted. And so we really wanted the series as a whole to be able to encompass this diversity. And when we were talking about the series, and we talked about Professor Jing Lu's book in particular, I was so excited about her book. I don't know if she knows or realizes how excited I was when I heard about her book. Because when I was thinking about the series, I thought that this book perfectly encapsulates many of the complexities of what the series was trying to do. It is not just China-centric, of course. It is not just historical. It is definitely historical, but it's also very theological in its emphasis as well. And also, while it is confessionally focused on Catholicism, it also narrates the lives of those who negotiate Protestantism and Catholicism, and also understandings of church-state relations and the state-sanctioned nature of the Catholic Patriotic Association, for instance. And so there was a lot in this book that I thought was really great for the series, and so I was very excited about that. But let me talk about the book itself and why I think everybody on this call and more should read this book, and more importantly, buy the book. And that is, and I take this as my comments are really as a scholar of Chinese Christianities, but really most of my scholarship has tended to focus on Protestantism. Although I've had an interest on the course of Catholicism as well, Chinese Catholicism. And I think that in many ways, this book is wonderful because, to begin with, it is one of the few books that covers the course of modern Chinese Catholic theology in such a way that no other book has done. Okay, so we don't really have many books in that have been able to do that in such a succinct and just a wonderful manner as this book. And it's also not China-centric. And I think that those two factors by themselves are actually quite important. Now, just to step aside from the book for a second, one of the major pieces of major historians of Chinese Christianities would be Daniel Bayes. And he's an important historian. He's now passed on, but he was a historian, and much of his focus was on Protestantism in China. And he came up with this very insightful kind of a statement, idea. Hi. Sorry, my children are popping in. A very insightful idea known as the Sino-Foreign Protestant Enterprise. The Sino-Foreign Protestant Enterprise. And I think that this idea that Daniel Bayes had was actually a very insightful observation that he made in terms of Chinese Protestantism. And what his emphasis was to speak about the Sino-Foreign, okay, and really what he was talking about was the Sino-American, okay, connections between for Chinese Christianity and Protestant Christianity in particular. And this was negotiated largely through educational institutions in China, Protestant educational institutions in China, and Protestant educational institutions in the US. So what do you have? You have a very Protestant, American, and Anglophone focus. Yeah? And so in many ways, I see Jean Lu's project as kind of introducing can I call it a Sino-Francophone Catholic enterprise. You may not accept that, but that I think is what you have an example of. Okay, and it offers a very different way of thinking about the development of Chinese Christianity, especially in a global sense. Two things I would say to this in particular. One is that it highlights the different types of Christian intellectuals, okay? Whereas the Protestants tended to be Protestant theologians that were situated in Protestant mission universities in China. Many of them were stimulated by May 4th, 1919, and they were emphasizing what they called a Chinese Christian Renaissance, okay, in response to the secular movement of a Chinese Renaissance. They wanted a Chinese Christian Renaissance, right? But instead of these Chinese Protestant theologians that are situated in universities and intellectuals in this sense, what we have in the Catholic discourse or the Catholic developments is, of course, education in China is developing, especially through a person like Ma Shangbo, right, that Jean Lu introduced. But the Chinese Catholic intellectuals are much more multifaceted than the Protestant ones. They're not only involved in education. They're priests, of course. They work in publication. They're diplomats. They're mystics. All these different types of people, not just these educational figures, right? And they're also deeply interconnected individuals. And that points to a second aspect, and that is the Christian networks that are being formed. Now, for the Chinese Protestants, the networks, I would say, are facilitated by a growing Protestant emphasis on ecumenism. Okay, in Protestant discourse, we will often talk about ecumenism as being born actually here in Edinburgh. So I'm based in Edinburgh. Edinburgh, 1910. Develops this idea called ecumenism, and the ecumenical relations between different churches around the globe. In the Catholic space, really what we have is the underscoring of Catholic networks that emphasize what is truly, if you will, Catholic, right? Catholic in the universal and the global sense of the word. And that, very much as Jean Lu was alluding to earlier, in many ways, Maximum Elude, 1919, such an important document that is stimulated by these debates that are happening in the Chinese context and shaping and anticipating the changes in Vatican II. And really, this highlights these dynamics that are very different from the Protestant developments, but really introduces us to a way of thinking about Chinese Christianities on a global level, as well as a localized level, and the contributions that Chinese Catholics have to not only Chinese Christianities, broadly speaking, but also in terms of Catholicism and the shape and course of Catholicism after Vatican II. So I think this book is really a brilliant contribution to scholarship, not only scholarship of Chinese Christianities and the ways in which it pushes against the dominant discourses within global Protestant conversations of Chinese Christianities, but also it reveals something more in terms of our understandings of Catholicism more generally, as well as the Chinese Catholic contribution to this wider discourse. It's about Catholicity, if you will, right? That the value, it underscores the value of these Chinese theologians for what people like Karl Rahner would have called the world church, right? This phase in which we talk about the world church is really anticipated and is prepared in many ways by these Chinese Catholic thinkers. So that's all I have to say. But really, thank you very much, Jean Lu, for a really brilliant book, and one that I really hope will be read widely, and not just amongst Chinese Christian scholars of Chinese Christianity, but well beyond. So thank you very much.
Many thanks, Dr. Chao, for your comments. I now invite Professor Vermonde to add his comments, and then I will let Professor Lu answer to both. Thank you.
Hello, do you hear me well? No problem? Do you hear me?
We hear you well.
Hello?
Yes, we hear you.
It's okay, you hear me?
Yes.
Good, excellent. Yeah. So I'm really happy to be here among friends, actually. We are ourselves an international translingual network in many ways. The speakers today come from Singapore, Chicago, Paris, Edinburgh, Shanghai, and of course, all the attendees come from many other places, and we are translingual, which means, at least for the speaker of this panel, none of us has English as his or her mother tongue. So in many ways, we are the posterity of the network of which Jean Lu is speaking about. Okay. We do know that recent scholarship on Chinese theology have focused on Chinese language research, the use of Chinese as a specific theological tools, which is perfectly legitimate, but on the long term, after a few decades, it has induced a slightly provincial perspective on the contribution brought up by Chinese theologians, and it underplays the international context and network that have molded the source of those theologians. So by focusing on translingual Chinese theologians, Jean Lu achieved several goals at the same time. She brings attention to neglected works and figures. She recaptured decisive episodes in the development of Chinese theology, and she locates Chinese theologians within the epochal changes that the global Catholic Church underwent from roughly 1920 to 1965, more or less. But more importantly, Jean Lu weaves the life and source of the figure she examines into a narrative, and this narrative gives extra depth and significance to each part of the story being told. So when we read this book, slowly, touch by touch, our vision of both the Chinese intellectual landscape and the globalization of the Catholic Church is transformed and enriched. For me, the main contribution of Jean Lu's book behind or beyond those historical narrative is that it makes theology a task that cannot be summarized as proclaiming one's faith in one mother tongue, as was understood by Ranu Shui at its beginning in a certain Barthian tradition, which was basically focusing on one's cultural and social standpoint. it rather makes theology an universal endeavor that mobilizes translation, the exercise of reason in its universality, which was an important topic in Matteo Ricci's presentation. Matteo Ricci basically was trying to say there is one word, there is one meta-language, the language of reason, and there is one God. And theology also, in the way Jinlu narrates it, is about the sharing, the network sharing of spiritual insights. So if I had to summarize the lessons to be gathered from Jinlu's book, I would do that in one sentence: the being of humankind into one. The two tasks cannot be separated. But I need to be understood well. At the same time, being universal also means being located somewhere. It is from where you are that you strive towards universality, that you have something to give and something to listen to. The theologians of whom Jinlu speaks were located in an in-between. That is their characteristic. They were still located. In-betweenness is a location like any other, if not the most comfortable one. And those theologians were speaking from where the difficult ecclesial, political, and international context of the time had located them. So the question I will ask, maybe not so much to Jinlu, but to everyone of us, will be, where does Chinese theology go on from today onwards? And specifically, how can Chinese theology conciliate the real fruits of Han Shui, of the fact of having started to do theology in Chinese, to make Chinese a language that speaks in the Catholic and Christian world of the mystery of God. Of course, it was started already in the 17th century, but let's say in a way that was still embryonic. But it has developed as a systematic and global endeavor from the, let's say, 1970s onwards in Taiwan, and from the 1980s onwards in mainland China. So coming back to my question, how can Chinese theology both take hold of take stock of the fruits of this endeavor of speaking, reasoning about God in Chinese, and still share those fruits and take full advantage of the interaction, the interlinguistical research that builds up the global theological endeavor of today in a shared encounter of both reason, spirituality, and context. Of course, this is not only the challenge met by Chinese theology, but the focus on language that has become the focus of Chinese theology since the last 40 years makes this task especially arduous. There is no easy answer. There is certainly a decentering of Chinese theology to operate today, contrarily to what the task, let's say, 40 years ago. And this decentering might go, at least this is my own conviction, by the fact of placing Chinese theology not so much in the so-called global context, which today is too much the North American context, but rather by having Chinese theology find its place in Asian theology, in a regional context. And I do think that Chinese theologians today have much more to learn from notably Korean theology, but also Vietnamese or Thai theology. Or yes, there is a nascent Thai theology. There is an underdeveloped but still extremely interesting Japanese theology. There is, of course, a thriving Filipino theology. So it will be good for, and I don't speak, of course, of the most important of those Asian theological expressions, i.e. the Indian theology, which is, I would say, a regional theology of its own. So it will probably be good for Chinese theologians to locate themselves more clearly into this regional environment, to learn from it, and to find all ways to share their own insights with their regional partners. Ultimately, there is first a regional Asian theology to build up in exchange, in encounter, in translingual encounters, indeed, and through this building up of an Asian theology, a truly global theology that wouldn't be a Western theology at the same time could be slowly developed. Though this is my own conviction, actually, since a long time, and the reading of Jinlu's book has only made it stronger. Though this is what I wanted to share tonight, thanking again Jinlu for having engaged with so much passion and expertise in an extremely rich and revealing historical quest. Many thanks to all of you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Professor Vermander, for your comments and these research perspectives. And I give the floor to Jinlu.
Thank you so much. I'm almost speechless. Thank you, Alex. Thank you, Benoit. And you two said more good things about my book than I dare to think about it myself. So I truly appreciate it. Just some brief responses to your comments. To Alex, yes, I do think that for a book that's called Translingual Catholics, I did talk a lot about Protestantism. It's precisely because of the fact that when Ma Xiangbo, who I call the father of modern Chinese Catholicism, when he came to the world stage, he was very in tune with the development of Protestantism in China. And his view was, I would say that at the time, was amazingly, let's put it that way, it was in competition, but there was no acrimony in his attitude with Protestantism. He also, in my book, I also talk about his collaboration with the scholar Chen Yuan, who was baptized in a Protestant church. And so that's Ma Xiangbo, and also his vision. And he was very much inspired by what the, let's put it that way, liberal Protestants are doing in terms of education in China. That was his emulation. And another interesting person in terms of relationship between Catholicism and Protestantism is Lu Zhenxiang. And of course, a lot of people read his book. So I did talk about his books in my book. However, I also talk about some archival research that correspondence that people haven't mentioned before. One of them is quite interesting. When he responded to a reader from Antwerp, Belgium, who seemed to be insinuating that his parents were not Catholic, therefore might not be saved. So he usually don't respond to readers personally because he was old and very sick. But he did have a response for this person, and talking about how he believed that his parents, his father, he had this confidence that God would save them. That's an interesting, I think, backstory is that I invite you to read in my book, where I had a lengthier discussion about the problematic. Yes, I do think that, Alex, you're right. I do think about comparing the Catholic interculture Chinese Catholics to the Protestant foreign Protestant establishment. One thing I think the interculture, the translingual Catholic intellectuals, you're right, they are much more diverse, and also I think they looking from the perspective of what we are now, they have more consensus among Chinese Catholics. So they are more likely to become sources to which that Christianity in China can return to gain inspiration. To Benoit, yes, Benoit is a translingual theologian, that there's no doubt about it. And so you paid attention to the question of language and the global networks. And I think Benoit himself has been doing a lot with dialoguing with the Asian theologians that tend to be, I think within Catholicism, there are a lot of interactions between different dioceses. I think for Protestantism, probably there's more attention to Asian theologians. I think that's quite urgent. And in my afterward, I did respond to Hanyu Shenxue, because a book that's entitled Translingual Catholics wouldn't have been completed if there was no response to Hanyu Shenxue. I invite you to read my book for fuller development of my response. What I want to say today is that I'm about a decade younger than the early proponents of Hanyu Shenxue. I was precocious, so I think I understand when I came to the States. I was 25, but I had no voice yet. But I knew where they came from. I understand I think it was there for a reason. It was a time when China looked at the rest of the world, wanted to catch up. So Hanyu Shenxue, in a way, it was try to be made in China, but had a lot of imported parts. One of my criticism is that they did not give enough credit to historical Chinese Christians, and I will just stop there. Yes, thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much for this stimulating debate. We can now open the discussion to the floor. So to the audience, please don't hesitate to ask questions. Maybe I'm going to look at the chat box. Yes, there is some questions in the chat box. I can read them. The first one by James Xie. Professor Jean, thanks for your exciting book. I'm looking forward to reading it. You mentioned the aspect of mysticism. Are there any lesser known stories about Thomas Merton's engagement with Taoist and Buddhist traditions within this global Catholic network, particularly beyond his well-documented exchanges with Wu Jinxiong?
Okay, so Eva, you want me to respond to this question first before we move on to the next?
As you prefer, Jinlu.
Yes, I can do that. Well, Yes, it is true that Wu Jinxiong was the one that had more engagement with Thomas Merton, because Wu Jinxiong was Anglophone. He write and speak English. So I think other people that in my book, as far as I have read, certainly, and François Huang, he was more focused on the part that's Francophone parts, and so he translated Dao De Jing into French. There were all had prior to his translation. There were already translation of the Dao De Jing into French. In my book, I compare his translation with previous versions, and my assessment that his translation was, he understood Laozi as a mystic much better than previous French translator. But he did not. Among the groups that I studied, they did not precisely engage with Thomas Merton's mysticism. However, other than, yes, Wu Jinxiong was the one who indeed did more of that.
The next question. Thank you, Professor Lu. So from Peter Boros, thank you very much for the amazing presentation and discussion. My question would be to Professor Jin Lu. Could you elaborate on how Ma Xiangbo interpreted the Yu Zao Wu You passage of Zhuangzi and how he connected it to Christianity? Thank you.
Yes, I want to. Yu Zao Wu You in Zhuangzi, when Ma Xiangbo wrote it in his calligraphy as part of the gift on a scroll to Lu Zhengxiang, he interpreted he translated. He didn't. It was in Chinese, but to give this to Lu Zhenxiang when he was ordained to be a priest, he was comparing Lu Zhenxiang to someone who was walking with the Creator. So as an inscription, it did not elaborate how Zhuangzi can be connected to Christianity, and that job was done by Wang Changzhi in a very extensive way. So I think I say Ma Xiangbo was, I consider him the father of modern Chinese Catholicism, which is, yes, that inscription was an inspiration, but he did not develop that. He had the idea earlier, but Wang Changzhi was the one who developed it more fully. And yes, yeah, that's my brief response.
Okay, and then some compliments from Stephanie Wong. Great book and very insightful comments.
Thank you.
all. And then from Michael Chang, thank you for your lecture. I truly found it fascinating. Your research approach is thought-provoking. What I would like to ask is this. The Chinese Catholic intellectuals you mentioned in your talk, strictly speaking, were members or former members of international religious society, Chinese diplomats or scholars you studied abroad. Their transnational interactions were fortunately facilitated by pre-existing international networks and resources to share their theological view internationally. One question I'm curious, compared to those excellent translingual actors, how do you view local Chinese diocesan priests, secular clergy? Were they unable to establish translingual connections within the global church network? Or they just put forward the original theology thought during that period of time?
Thank you very much for the thought-provoking questions. And I'll be careful not to talk about the things that I don't know. And in my book, I talked about what I did know.
Jinlu, your microphone got disconnected. We can't hear you, and you are not muted, so it means your microphone is disconnected. Start again? No. So maybe you... It seems to be a technical, physical problem. Are you using an external microphone of your computer? We don't hear you at all. We don't hear you at all. Yeah, but we don't hear you at all.
If it may help, I may say something on that question. Will it help?
Maybe you can disconnect and reconnect, get out of Zoom and come back. Very sorry about that.
Michel or Eva?
Yes, sorry. Yes, sorry.
Yeah. If it may help, in the meanwhile, I might say a word about the question that was asked.
Yeah,
Will it be helpful? Okay. Yeah,
Yes,
I think that's a really interesting question. Indeed, Jinlu is speaking about the elite, but it doesn't mean that other Catholics in China at the local level were devoid of any connection or translingual capacities. The fact that it was a mission country, of course, as such, was creating all the time interactions between foreigner and Chinese Catholics. Those interactions were uneasy, unequal, but they were real. And you know, in the book of Harriet Harrison, which is well known and absolutely splendid, The Missionary's Curse, we see some local priests in conflict with Italian missionary who finally go to Rome and can plead their cause. So there were a number of things happening. Of course, there was a role of the Latin as an international language. It was not English. Most Chinese priests were speaking it at a rather basic level, but still it was a tool of communication, and so on and so on. So while recognizing that Jinlu has been speaking about the one who were weaponed with the best capabilities for developing international networking and international source, I think the interconnected status, nature even, of the Chinese church from its origin should be recognized. At the same time, this interconnected nature has not been only something that has created opportunities, but a lot of conflicts and inequalities as well. So interconnection goes with understanding and a lot of misunderstandings as well.
Well, I don't know if you can hear me now. I log in with my phone, so there should be sound. I don't know if there is audio or video. I haven't used my phone to Zoom before.
We can hear you.
Yeah, we hear you.
Yeah, but now I cannot see chat. So if anyone can give me the chat, so I will just okay, what was the question we were discussing? I lost the thread since I log off.
Yes, so Professor Vermander also answered the question, but I can read it again.
Sure.
Just the one question I'm curious, compared to those excellent translingual actors, how do you view local Chinese diocesan priests, secular clergy? Were they unable to establish translingual connections within the global church network, or they just put forward the original theology thought during that period of time?
Okay, I see. I did respond to some of that, but I think that was a time when my audio was cut off.
Yes.
So that's really a good question, because how when you write a book, you always worry about well, when I'm writing about those figures, but what about the other people? Am I just how do I deal with that? I think one thing is that when you go through archives, you notice that for instance, they're in Lu Zhenxiang, for instance, he was in contact with so many people. And I didn't even have the space to talk about it in my book about all the people who wrote to him. Some of those people would be, I think you would never. I think history would. They would have left no trace in history, like written record in history, had they not written to Lu Zhenxiang. But because they wrote to him, they were conserved. So for me, that was still a treasure trove to be explored. And my point is that they were able to write in other languages. That's how, in the historical context of the time, they were heard, had a voice. And as for people who did not write in other languages, I'm sure that I think to get their message across, they would need some intermediaries to act as a medium so that their message can carry through. So I hope that my book or those figures that I study are in a way channeling other voices as well. Okay, now
Sorry,
I see
I was
Eva.
muted. Yes,
Okay.
I was muted. Sorry, Jilu. There is a message from Margaret Mary Moore. Not a question, but some compliments. But I'm going to read them for you. Many thanks for this important and substantial work. I am especially grateful since I do not speak or read Chinese, but have great appreciation and interest in learning more about Chinese history, culture, and religion. You have done a great service to the global Catholic and Christian community.
Thank you, thank you.
And I, while waiting for other questions from the audience, I do have a question for you, Jean.
Go ahead, Eva.
Thank you. Since I am at the Catholic University of Paris, Institut Catholique de Paris, I'm curious to know what role this institute played in the education of Chinese Catholics at the time. Were there people at the Catholic University of Paris who were sensitive to the reception, to the welcoming of Chinese Catholics?
Yes, I think the answer is certainly yes, from what I know. And for instance, Wang Changzhi was, I think especially, I'm sorry, when one of the figures that I studied, Jin Luxian, visited France in the 1980s, and a lot of you may know that there was a time that he was more or less shunned by, let's say, international Catholic organizations, and it was people were suspicious of him. But at the time, I know that he was hosted and gave talk, met people at the Catholic University of Paris. So there was a lot of connections. And also know that Huang Jiacheng, as far as I remember, also had connections with Institut Catholique de Paris.
Thank you. Thank you so much. if in the audience, if do you have questions, please don't hesitate to unmute and ask.
Dinlun, if I may, do you have any insights or any comment on the ongoing, so to elaborate on Eva comment, indeed, there are a number of priests and Chinese lay people speaking in French, either in France, Belgium, Switzerland, Canada. So the Sino-French theological world is still well alive today. So any comment on that? Because I do know that you interact with...
Yes, yeah, of course. I think I just read an excellent article by Benoit about the Shanghai Catholic culture journal. Well, I have a special affinity for culture journal as I studied Jesuit culture journal in 18th century. But Benoit just published an article about a Shanghai Catholic culture journal called Divine Love, 圣爱. And I think in that article I read a lot about, but not talk about a lot about the Francophone Chinese Catholics. So can I just pass this ball to Benoit?
If I understand well the question of Michel, it is about, let's say, the connection between France and Chinese Catholics today. Is that so?
Yeah, it's about...
Yes, I think they remain... Yes. I think they remain extremely alive. For instance, in Shanghai, we do have a lot of doctoral students studying medieval theology or philosophers like Jean-Luc Marillon in Paris. So, well, of course, they go to several countries, but Paris is a place of special attraction, and the tradition of France, Alain de Libera and so on, both on medieval theology and, let's say, on what I would call a kind of Christian phenomenology or post-phenomenology, is very attractive for, let's say, young Chinese Catholic intellectuals. So we're speaking about, I will say, a steady number of doctoral students on the last, well, I can witness myself on the last 16 or 17 years. Yes, every year you have one or two new students who goes and who engage into new studies around those fields, especially the two I mentioned. I do see also in Shanghai, for instance, a little reading group of Chinese intellectuals about Chinese translation of Méditation sur l'Église of de Lubac. Okay, no, Catholicism, I'm sorry, of de Lubac. Though there are reading books today in China about de Lubac. And I would say, especially converted Chinese Catholics like de Lubac very much because balance the gen. And the de Lubac, or before or after the Fourvière period, is indeed someone who was trying faithful to the tradition to invent a canon. I say in my article actually that we should differentiate among different groups. There are some who are very attracted by what I call the monastic model, you know, making the church a kind of monastery in contemporary Chinese society. Others are very much attracted by the Ignatian model. And we have Chinese who have studied at what was the Centre Sèvres and is now Loyola Paris faculties, Loyola Paris. So who have studied French-speaking Ignatian spiritualities. And others remain fascinated by the Catholic modernity of the 1930s, which is an important book of Jin Lu's book. So among those Chinese Catholics, there are different schools and traditions with some mute oppositions, or at least contrast, but those three schools, in one way or another, have indeed a kind of French connection, if I may say so.
And if I may, it goes also the other way around. You are, as a Belgium, I am, Eva, we are a number of us from French people engaging from French. And it's something significant, and you see that when you go to Taipei or Hong Kong.
Thank you, Benoit and Michel. I see that Professor Yang has a question.
Hello. Okay. Thank you. Professor Liu, I have a question. You know, there's the anti-Christian movement in the 1920s. How did the Chinese Catholic theologians respond to it? Any typical response to the anti-Christian movement in the 1920s?
Thank you very much, Feng Gang. And yes, Ma Xiangbo was the one that mainly responded to it. The other protagonist of my book, Lu Zhenxiang, was a government official at the time, so he did not really publicly responded to it. And other protagonists are young. But Ma Xiangbo was the one who very explicitly responded to anti-Christian movement. And I also think he said something that's very profound. He said that that's precisely why we should have Catholic universities in China, because our educational level needs to be at the level to be able to respond to the challenges, because by then there are people who studied abroad, came back from Europe, from America, with those challenges that echoes what's going on abroad. But he really thinks that if we're undereducated, how would we be able to respond to it? So I think his response was twofold. One is he personally responded to it. The second is also that gave him more motivation to create Catholic universities in China.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. It's 2:30 here in Paris, and so we are forced to finish this fascinating debate. So thank you very much, everybody, for taking the time to join us online, and particularly to Professor Jin Lu for her fascinating presentation, and to Professor Vermondaire and Dr. Chow for your valuable input. Oh, sorry for the echo. And I would like also to take the opportunity to thank Michel Chambon for all his help with the technicalities of the webinar. So please keep an eye out for information on our next webinar, which will be held in the near future. Thank you very much, everybody, and goodbye.
Goodbye. Goodbye.
Bye-bye, and thanks to everyone. Till next time.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.